Scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." Well, one of the things about television, movies, is they used to be so clear-cut about who was good and who was evil. And so you had all those tropes about, Westerns where the black hat was the bad guy and stuff like that, and it was so obvious. But ambiguity has been the norm for at least the last generation. And one of the first shows was like The Sopranos, okay, where it was really morally ambiguous. And so you would have these folks like, Walter White, or Breaking Bad, all right, Dexter, okay, and then Tony Soprano. And these are all, there are different terms for them, whether they are anti-heroes or sometimes they're referred to as a villain protagonist in a show. And this ends up creating a complexity for writers, especially when it comes to the end of the story. How do you close out the story of a person who was an anti-hero, a person who was a villain protagonist? And so, Tony Soprano, the ambiguous cut to black at the end where he's always on the lookout for who's after him. Walter White does not meet a good end. And I remember the showrunner for Dexter said this about that show's ending. He said, "Look, a serial killer can't walk happily into the sunset." All right, and so they decided that because of who he had been, what he had done, they could not write a pleasant ending for him, okay? Because we tend to want moral clarity in outcomes, and morally compromised characters make it difficult for us, all right? But we are morally complex people, okay? And so life doesn't actually work with that same degree of binary moral clarity, all right? There is good and bad in every single person, and so it's just not so obvious, not so easy what kind of ending you're going to want for the story. Now, last week, I remember in the message, I said, it was the story of the lost sheep. Last week, I said, the story is so simple, it's so clear, there's nothing subtle here in this story, okay? This week is the exact opposite. This is one of the most hotly debated passages in all of Scripture as far as Jesus' stories are concerned, okay? And it's hotly debated because of the moral ambiguity here and the fact that the heroes of the story, or the central characters, are morally compromised. All right, and so that makes this a really difficult story for people to try and understand. It begins with a manager who is squandering the owner's property. Now notice the audience is the disciples. And I mentioned this last week. I mention it so often that we always begin by looking at who Jesus is talking to. And in this case, he's talking to the disciples. And in general, Jesus is able to be a little more nuanced and subtle in his teaching of the disciples. He teaches his disciples at a more complicated level than he teaches the crowds. When he teaches the crowds, he keeps it pretty simple. When he's talking to his enemies, there's an antagonism present in what Jesus is saying. When he's teaching his disciples, he's generally teaching them with more nuance and subtlety because, they're the ones who really need to learn the second level differences in what's going on. Now, this word squandering is interesting because you don't see it very often in Scripture. One of the other stories where you see it is the prodigal son. The prodigal son goes out, blows his money on loose living, and it was referred to as squandering. Okay? So the squandering implies an immoral use of the property. All right? It's not just that he's taking money that is not his or using it in a way that the owner doesn't want. He's using it immorally, and the fact that word is coming back to the rich man, coming back to his boss about it, indicates that this is a public thing, all right? So he is squandering the money. He's using it immorally in such a way that people see it. Now, it's not just waste. Remember, the rich man hasn't even noticed that the property is missing, okay? So somewhere in here, the rich man, hasn't noticed this. All it is that he is hearing about the squandering, and that actually is making it a reputational issue. It's not the money, and we're going to delve into that a little more. And so he goes to the manager, and he says, "What is this that I hear about you?" All right, it's based on what he heard. And based on what he heard, he decided that the person had to be fired. So he says, "Look, give me an accounting of your management because you cannot be my manager any longer." Now, that word accounting is actually a broader term. The word doesn't actually appear in the Greek text. And so the sentence gets filled in different translations slightly differently. So in the NRSV, the one we use, he says, "Give me an accounting of your management." But in a translation like the NIV that a lot of denominations use, the word is just very slightly different. It says, "Give an account of your management." In other words, in the Greek, what he actually just says to him is, "Tell me about your management." All right, that's all he says is, "Tell me about your management." When you use the word accounting, you start to think QuickBooks, spreadsheets, show me give me a balance sheet. But the guy hadn't noticed the money was missing, and it's not about that. It's about, give me an account. Tell me what you're doing, all right? Give me a reckoning of your management. Now, the manager understands that he's in trouble. And so he understands that when he does give this account of what he's done with the rich man's property, he's in trouble. And so he says to himself, "What will I do?" And so he's considering his options. Now, clearly, he hasn't saved money. He squandered it, right? He blew it all on loose living. And you don't actually know exactly what that is, all right? You don't know, and you don't know the ways in which it may have just been to make himself look good or whatever. Maybe he's the biggest tipper at the local restaurant or whatever, I don't know, all right? And so he's considering his options, and what he decides on is really interesting. He decides that what he needs to do is focus on how people might be led to welcome him into their homes. It's an interesting question to ask. If everything in your life fell apart, what would you rely on? If everything in your life fell apart, who would be there for you? Okay? I mean, this is a really interesting question of what really is, at the end of the day, what is your core safety net? All right? What's there for you if everything falls apart? All right. It's a really interesting question. I've had some friends who had this happen in your life. You've probably had some friends of your own who've had that happen, where where everything is okay and suddenly everything in their life just goes and blows up suddenly at one time, and they have to face this question of what is actually there that they can rely on. And what this person is realizing is that what he has to rely on if everything in his life falls apart is relationships. And that's actually what I have found with my friends who've gone through this, okay? All right? That at the end of the day, what matters more than anything, the thing you can rely on, or you should be able to rely on over anything else, is your relationships. Whether that is friends or whether that is family, whatever it is, because we've all heard that phrase that when people hit hard times, we've all heard the phrase where people go, well, this is when you find out who your friends are. Right? And boy, have I seen in life that is true. Okay? When everything is falling apart, you really do find out who your true friends are. Who are the people who will stick by you no matter what you've done? Who are the people who will stick by you no matter what has happened in your life? Who are the ones who are there for you no matter what? And this is certainly something that I have not only learned, but the older I get, the truer it gets. Because the older I get, the longer some of my longest friendships are, all right? I mean, I've got 10-year friends. I've got 20-year friends. But I'm old enough now to have 50-year friends, okay? All right? And when you're 25, you can't have a 50-year-old friend. You can't have someone who's been your friend for that many decades. But I've got 50-year friends at this point, all right? And I understand that those are people who will stick with you. And then also, the older you get, the more you have a trail of fair weather friends who are in your past. The ones who fell away, the ones who just kind of learned, and sometimes with deep regret, sometimes with a considerable amount of hurt, that they weren't there for you, when things got hard. So he understood the value of relationships. He understood the value of having that bedrock circle of people around you who will be there for you no matter what. So he decides he's going to build some relationships. And does it, well, not in a great way, all right? He does it because what he says, like, hey, you owe 100 jugs of olive oil? Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Now, what's interesting, all right, is that he's not taking a kickback, all right? He doesn't sit there and say, hey, take your bill, make it 50, give me 10 on the side, okay? All right, he doesn't say that. He simply reduces the debt. Now, I'm not advocating this as a strategy for making friends, because I actually think he would find out that a lot of the people who he thinks will welcome him into their homes because he did this won't. That's kind of just the way it works. I mean, that's how life is. So I'm not sure this was a great strategy for achieving his objective, but he simply reduces the debt. Now, here's one of the things you need to understand, is the historical context of these numbers. First of all, these are massive, massive quantities, all right? This is not, hey, can you go to Costco and pick up a couple extra jugs of olive oil for me, all right? This is not even Costco Business Center size jugs, all right? So 100 jugs of olive oil is 600 gallons, all right? 100 containers of wheat is about 33 tons, all right? So the only way you get to these kinds of debts, these levels of debt, is that the implication historically is that the rich man owned land and he was leasing the land to farmers. And the way rent was prescribed in those days is that the rent on the land was a fixed amount of produce per year, all right? And so it might be, okay, you get this much land, and your rent is going to be, 50 jugs of olive oil. Your rent is 50 jugs of olive oil. Now, if you have a bad harvest, whatever, bugs, whatever, drought hits, whatever, maybe you only get enough olives to make 40 jugs of olive oil, and your rent is 50. And when that happens, the rich man gets all 40 jugs of your olive oil, you get nothing, and the 10 more that you owe gets added on to next year's rent. So now, so you made nothing that year, your 40 jugs went all away, and next harvest, next year, you owe 60 jugs. All right. And so that is how these poor farmers could have their debt escalating, all right? And meanwhile, they're starving. They're suffering really badly because the rent was fixed. It was not a percentage of your harvest. It was a fixed amount every year. Now, the other thing the person says, which is kind of interesting, is this. He said, sit down quickly and write it out. When the manager does this, the people for whom he does it would have presumed that he had the authority to do it, all right? He's not indicating that he's cheating by doing this, all right? He's just trying to tell them that, sit down. He's doing it as a favor. And quickly could have been, and most likely was interpreted as, this deal, my boss, the rich man, he said to do this. Do it before he changes his mind. All right, sit down quickly. Do this. All right, this is a buy now. Go buy the car before the deal expires on Friday. This is definitely, you got to hop on this offer before the offer goes away. All right. They would have presumed he had the legitimate authority from the rich man to do this, or else they would know that the reduction wasn't valid, right? Okay, so they would have presumed he had the authority to do this. And so he's like, do it quick. I don't know what got into my boss's brain, but he decided to make this offer, so take advantage of it. Do it before he changes his mind. And then, of course, the rich man hears about it and says to him, good job. This is the shocker. This is the one that makes everybody go, what? All right? The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. And then says, the children of this age, the secular folks, are more shrewd than are the children of light. Shrewd is this word, right, that means to act with insight or wisdom. All right? And so the rich man, and in these parables, we presume that when you have an owner figure, a master figure, that it's God. And so we presume in the parables that this person is God, this person is Jesus, and this person is saying, look, you did a good thing. For the children and the children of this age, dishonest ones, they're actually acting with more insight and wisdom than the believers, than the children of light. Jesus is teaching the disciples that maybe Christians, followers, know less about what matters than the rest of the world. Sometimes that's actually true. Sometimes we see it in our own world right now, that we can see people who claim the name of Christ and act in such a way that doesn't reflect what I believe Jesus wanted, all right? And yet there are so many people who claim to be followers of Christ and buy into that, whereas we have people who are non-believers who embrace a lot of the values that we believe are so central to Jesus, the values of love, the values of mercy, the values of inclusion. We believe those are so central, and so often it is persons outside the faith who embrace those values more strongly than some people who are inside the faith. And sometimes we take a look at these things and we look at them in a very narrow point, from a very narrow point of view, where we don't realize, that the owner's interest isn't money. See, the outcome is surprising because everybody presumed from the start that what the owner was worried about was the money. The money that the owner didn't know was missing in the first place, all right? And when we don't understand what's really important to someone, we may not make the decisions that are correct in their eyes. Y'all have done this. You've made a decision in your life that you thought either your parents or your boss would react very differently to than they actually did. Okay? All right? Sometimes you've done something you thought, oh, my parents are going to kill me, and they don't. Or you've done something and thought, my boss is going to love this, and they didn't. Okay? And often it's because they actually had different priorities in making the decision, all right, in analyzing the situation, than you thought the priorities were going to be, all right? And when it turns out that the money isn't the issue, that's a shocking surprise to the people who hear the story. They think the owner's interest here is the fact that the guy was stealing the money. But instead, what happens is he says, look, you've not been faithful with the dishonest wealth. Who will entrust you true riches? And if you've not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what's your own? And what Jesus is doing here is he's using that word and he's teaching the disciples to look at the word faithful differently, because it is really jarring to us to have a story of dishonesty end up with the owner calling it faithful. And maybe it means that we need to rethink what it means to be faithful. What does being faithful mean? Because we often focus so much on the idea of being faithful, meaning that we don't break the rules. Don't break the rules. God said, don't do this, so we don't do that, and we decide that that is what it means to be faithful. But other aspects of faithful include important things like what it means to bring honor to God, what it means to inspire others to honor God. All right? And if you step back and look at the actual outcomes in this story, the story takes on a slightly different tone. Here's the actual outcomes. The debtors were relieved. They owed an insane amount of produce, and now they owed less. So the people who were in debt owe less. This is a good outcome. They're relieved. A bunch of pressure is removed off the debtor. Second, the owner now looks good, right? See, the manager squandering his money only made the owner look worse. Okay, the managers, because that, if I owe, they know the manager's paid by the owner, right? And if you owe this crushing debt to the owner, and you see his manager just out there blowing money on all kinds of immoral stuff, how do you feel, right? How do you feel? Okay. I remember the story when I was in high school. Everybody learned the story. I was my part-time job in high school. We were in a union. We were in a local of Service Employees International Union, and they were negotiating with the company. And this is in the 70s. We're making like $2.10 an hour. All right, and we have a union. They're negotiating, and we all heard the story that the company's rep pulls up to the building for the meeting in his Lamborghini. So how do you feel? Right? Okay. We're sitting there trying to, our union is trying to argue for a 25-cent an hour raise against the person who pulls up in his Lamborghini. Okay. I mean, how does that look? And so the manager's out there squandering the money, which only made the owner look worse. The owner hadn't even missed the money, and now the owner looks good because they presume that the manager cut these bills. And now the owner went from looking like a rich man whose manager was just blowing his money willy-nilly on all kinds of loose living, and instead the owner relieved their debts. So maybe this story is giving us a different angle on what it means to be faithful. Because in here, the dishonest manager, there are two things. Maybe faithful means make life easier for people. Make life easier for people. When you meet people, make their life easier. Whatever you can do to make someone's life a little easier, maybe that's a big part of being faithful. And secondly, when you talk about your faith, when you live into your faith, when you do what you do as a Christian, make Jesus someone people would want to know. I mean, if your attitude toward faith is that it's all about rule following and it's all about being judgmental of those who don't do the right thing and all that kind of stuff, if you think people should know Jesus, and I believe that everyone should know Jesus, all right, then you have to kind of make Jesus sound like somebody they would want to know. I mean, you don't sit there and say, oh yeah, I have this friend Joe. Yeah, he's kind of mean, judgmental, never forgives anybody who does something to him. You should get to know him. All right? You'd be like, sorry, no thanks. I don't think I want to know him, right? Are we through our own lives, through the way we live our faith, are we portraying Jesus as someone people would want to know? All right? People want to know a loving, merciful, gracious Jesus. All right? And if you spend your faith acting as one who lives in fear of the rules, who's judgmental about the faults of others, who wants that? Nobody wants a part of that. All right? And the reason why we can understand that even morally compromised characters can get a happy ending is because we get one. So if you remember what that showrunner said about Dexter, serial killers can't walk happily into the sunset. But the point of our faith is that we get to walk happily into the sunset. All right? So if you're bothered by the moral ambiguity of this person being commended, you'll be bothered by our own stories. Because we are all squanderers and sinners. But we, through the grace of God, through the mercy of God, through the God who loves us, lets us walk happily into the sunset. Amen.